Well, hopefully by now you have gotten a really good handle on all the different organelles of the cell, what they do, and how each one of those organelles starts contributing to the functions of life that the cell has to engage in order to stay alive. We're going to take some time now and focus on the plasma membrane or the cell membrane, because that is really the gateway to getting in and out of the cell. It's got to go through the membrane in order to get into the cell. It's got to go through the membrane to get out of the cell. And so understanding the structure of the cell membrane is going to be really, really important for us to understand how things get in and out of the cell. If you recall, back in Module 3, and I believe it was video number 5, we talked about lipid formation, and we said that a lipid is made up of a glycerol molecule and it has 3 fatty acids attached to it. And we said that's how a lipid is structured. In a cell membrane, we actually have, in place of just a lipid, we have what's called a phospholipid. And a phospholipid has the same basic structure where it has a glycerol, but it only has 2 fatty acids, and in place of that 3rd fatty acid, it actually has a phosphate group up here. And that phosphate group is important because it has a negative charge on it. And so while this molecule is going to be nonpolar, which means that a lipid is going to be something that's not going to dissolve in water very well, a phospholipid has this end on it up here that has a charge, so it is going to like dissolving in water, whereas this side of it is not going to like dissolving in water. So it actually has 2 different ends. Now, in order to now obviously here I wrote this out in words and didn't write the entire diagram like I did back in the other video, because that takes a long time to write out all those C's and H's and all those bonds and stuff. So I kind of used a shortcut. Well, we were going to use an even bigger shortcut. A lipid is generally represented by a circle for the glycerol, and then we use these 3 wavy lines coming off of it to represent the 3 fatty acids that are on it. Well, for a phospholipid, it's going to have the same head, but it's only going to have 2 tails on it with these 2 fatty acid tails. And so if I look at this, what this is that this is the phospholipid, but this end up here is hydrophilic, which means it's water-loving, it likes water. But this end down here, and that's because of the phosphate group, remember, this end down here is hydrophobic. It does not like water, and that's because it's nonpolar, just like a lipid is. And so it's like an oil, kind of like, where it's not going to appreciate being in with all these polar water molecules. Remember, we talked about polar water molecules, how they have a positive end and a negative end. So this end likes water, this end does not like water. And so the structure of a cell membrane actually has 2 layers of these phospholipids. And so it kind of looks like this. I have a layer of phospholipids on one side that goes this direction. And then I have a layer of phospholipids on the other side, but it turns the other direction. And if you think about it, that should make sense, because these heads all like water and the tails do not like water. And so these parts that don't like water are all going to be together, and the parts that do like water are going to be apart from each other, because here, this is the way this whole part together makes up the cell membrane, like this. And so one side here, this is going to be outside of the cell, and then this down here is going to be the inside of the cell. So this whole thing makes up like you can think of it almost as a wall that's going to keep things from going in and out of the cell unless it specifically lets different things through. Now, it's not just the phospholipids that make up the structure of the cell. There are some other things that make up the structure of the cell too. You have a diagram in your book on page 158 that you can refer to. And I've also given you a coloring sheet with the cell membrane on it. Picture looks a little bit different, but as I believe I mentioned before, it's good to look at different representations by different artists because it just helps you get an overall better picture, overall view of what that particular structure looks like. So if you notice, there are some other things that are involved in the structure of the cell. If you look specifically at letter F and at letter G, on here. So letter F kind of almost looks like this, almost looks like kind of like a bead that's almost embedded into all of these phospholipids. And then letter G is a lipid that looks like it's just, maybe you can just see the one side of it. You've got two different kinds of proteins that are in the cell membrane. Some of them are integral, like the one in letter F, where that means it goes all the way from one side to the other side of the membrane. So I may have a lipid that goes all the way from one side to the other side like this, a protein, or I may have some proteins that they may just kind of be down here on one side of the membrane. Those proteins are used, if it's an integral protein where it goes all the way across, those are used as a bridge, and they help to move larger molecules across the membrane that the cell needs either to move in or to move out. And we're going to talk exactly about how that works in a day or two here. Some of the other proteins are peripheral membranes, and so these are in here for support, just to provide a little bit of rigidity and a little bit of structure to the membrane. You can also see in this picture carbohydrates, which is letter K. They're these guys that are kind of sticking up here on the top. And what those things do is they are attached to the proteins, and cells use them to communicate with each other, to recognize each other. I think she specifically mentions blood types. Some of the carbohydrates are on the outside of the different blood cells to communicate blood type. Your cells can also recognize each other so that they can recognize when an invading cell comes in. And so that's how your immune system works. If they don't recognize that protein or that carbohydrate on the outside of the cell, they're like, that's an enemy cell. We need to attack that cell and get it out of here because it doesn't belong in this body. It shouldn't be here. It's an enemy, so we need to get rid of it. So those types of things help cells recognize one another. The other piece of the cell that you need to recognize here is letter E. And letter E is actually a cholesterol molecule. You can actually see it, I think, a little bit better on page 158. You can see the cholesterol molecule that's kind of embedded within the membrane there. And the purpose for the cholesterol, and that's in animal cells, is going to help keep that membrane fluid. The cool thing about plasma membranes is that they are able to come apart and to reassemble themselves relatively easily. So if something disrupts this membrane, these phospholipids are easily able to reassemble themselves because all the hydrophobic parts are going to line up and all the hydrophilic parts are going to line up with each other. So if the membrane gets separated for some reason, it's very easy for it to go back together. And again, kind of just store that in the back of your mind because you're going to see why that's so important here in another couple of days. So, excuse me, all of these parts of the cell membrane are important. There will be a diagram on your test of a cell membrane, so make sure that you can identify the different pieces of the cell membrane and recognize them and recognize what each one of those different parts are. Okay, so that's the cell membrane.